Hi everyone, today we're going to go over solving trig equations. These are one of the Excel steps you have to do while I am out of the office, so I just wanted to go over how to go about doing it. You'll see up here that I have a chart of the table that we did before with all of our special angles. You'll see it in degrees and radians, and also you'll see for the quadrantal angles, 90, 180, 270, and 360. Also pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, right? So the radian measures are there as well. Also, one thing to remember is what is positive in which quadrant, because we're going to have more than one answer for most of these problems. So remember, first quadrant, everything is positive. Second quadrant, only sine is positive. And remember, cosecant, I'm just going to abbreviate that up here. Cosecant follows sine. Cotangent follows tangent, and secant follows cosine. So wherever sine is positive, cosecant will be positive. Wherever tangent is positive, cotangent will be positive. Wherever cosine is positive, secant will be positive. So we are going to approach this just like we would solving any other equation. One thing that you will also see on the problems in Excel is they're going to give you a range of where they want answers from. So they'll say something like all answers from 0 to 2 pi. And that is basically telling you that you need to give all of the answers in that range. So let me walk you through how we're going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and solve this equation for sine of theta. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. That gives me 4 equals 8 sine theta. Which means if I divide both sides by 8, I get 1/2 is sine theta. And so now I say to myself, okay, so 1/2, where is that? Well, for sine, that's at 30 degrees or pi over 6. Right? So I'm going to say, okay, that must mean then that theta is pi over 6. Now, here's where this part comes into play. You want to say to yourself, okay, sine is not only positive in the first quadrant, but it's also positive in the second. So I need to give that answer as well. If I'm in the second quadrant, remember right here is pi, which is the same as 6 pi over 6. Okay, 6 pi over 6. So if I'm in the second quadrant, I go 1 back from there. Remember, my numerator is 1 less than my denominator in the second quadrant. So my second answer would be 5 pi over 6. And those are my two answers because sine is positive in two places from 0 to 2 pi. Remember, 0 to 2 pi goes from 0 to 360. Now notice there's a parenthesis here. That's just saying that it doesn't include 2 pi, but it goes everything up to 2 pi. So it's just one way they write it. So it includes 0, but doesn't include 2 pi. But remember, we're always looking for two answers. We have to consider the two places where that particular trig function is positive or negative. So we're going to use this chart, but then we're also going to use our little cheat here of the ASTC. Now, this chart, you have a version of this in your notes. I just expanded it to include cosecant, secant, cotangent. If you want to just pause the video and take a screenshot of that so you have it. And you can do that as well. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at another problem. Okay. So again, we're going from 0 to 2 pi. And we've got 1 equals 3 plus 4 cosine theta. So again, I'm just going to solve this for cosine theta. I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So I end up with a negative 2 is equal to 4 cosine theta, and if I divide both sides by 4, I get cosine theta is negative 1/2. So I want to say to myself, okay, if I'm talking about negative, I have to figure out where cosine is negative. Cosine is negative in 2 and 3, so I know my answer is going to be, I'm going to have an answer with a second quadrant angle and a third quadrant angle. So I've taken care of the negative already because I'm figuring out which quadrants I'm in. So that takes care of the negative. Now let's focus on the 1/2. If I go to my table, cosine and 1/2 is right here. That means it's pi over 3, right? So I'm dealing with pi over 3. or some version of pi over 3. Okay, but remember, I'm not in the first quadrant. I'm in the second quadrant and I'm in the third quadrant. So if I'm in the second quadrant, my numerator is 1 less than my denominator, which means that my answer would be 2 pi over 3. And if I'm in the third quadrant, my numerator is 1 more than my denominator, so I'm at 4 pi over 3. And those are my two answers. Okay, this right here, this pi over 3 right here, this is just my reference theta. I'm just using that to help me get these two answers. That's just telling me how far I have to go from the x-axis in the two quadrants that I need to be in. But this right here is my answer. It's those two angles because those are the two quadrants where cosine is negative from 0 to 2 pi. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Here I've got one with tangent. So if I go ahead and solve this, if I add 3 to both sides, I end up with negative 4. Tangent of theta is equal to 4. And if I divide both sides by negative 4, I get tangent of theta is negative 1. Okay, so let's not worry about the negative. Let's first, let's deal with the negative first and then we don't have to worry about it. So which two quadrants is tangent negative in? Tangent is negative in the second and the fourth. So I know that my two answers have to be in the second quadrant and in the fourth quadrant. Okay, so let's figure out what that theta is, that reference. I'll call it reference theta to help us get our final answers. If I go to my table, I'm going to go to tangent. I'm going to go over to 1 because I already dealt with the negative. And that would be 45 degrees or pi over 4. So in the second quadrant, my numerator is 1 less than my denominator. So this would be 3 pi over 4. And in the fourth quadrant, my numerator is 1 less than twice my denominator, right? So if I double my denominator, I get 8. 1 less than that would be 7. So this would be 7 pi over 4. And those are my two answers there. Okay, last one. We'll try one more. This is how the problem was asked in Acellus, and you'll see they give, this is solve the equation on the interval from 0 to 2 pi, okay, and this is how they're giving you the answer, so we got to fill in that part. So I've got root 2 cosine x minus 1 is equal to 0. So if I add 1 to both sides, and if I divide both sides by by root 2, I end up with 1 over root 2. Okay, so I'm positive, which means I'm going to be in the first and the fourth quadrant. So I have an answer in 1 and an answer in 4. So if I go to my sheet, go to cosine, go to 1 over root 2, that's pi over 4. So I know that pi over 4 is one of my answers. And then again in the fourth quadrant, I'm 1 less than twice my denominator. So I'm at 7 pi over 4. Okay, so that's how you're going to approach these problems. If they give you any intervals in terms of degrees, then just deal with the degrees. And remember that here is 180 degrees. And so if you're in the third quadrant, you would, subtract from 180 degrees. If you're in the third quadrant, you would add to 180 degrees. Okay, and if you're in the fourth quadrant, you would just subtract from 360 degrees. So it works for radians and for degrees. It just depends on what interval they ask you to use. Okay, so that should help you guys get through that, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.